Section 3 of Danger and Other Stories. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Danger and Other Stories by Sir Arthur Conan Doyle. Section 3 of Danger, Part 3. It was on Wednesday night that the Iota crossed to Etretat. It was Friday afternoon before we had reached our new cruising ground. Only one large steamer did I see upon our way. The terror we had caused had cleared the channel. This big boat had a clever captain on board. His tactics were excellent and took him in safely to the Thames. He came zigzagging up the channel at 25 knots, shooting off from his course at all sorts of unexpected angles, and with our slow pace we could not catch him, nor could we calculate his line so as to cut him off. Of course he had never seen us, but he judged, and judged rightly, that wherever we were, those were the tactics by which he had the best chance of getting past. He deserved his success. But of course it is only in a wide channel that such things can be done. Had I met him in the mouth of the Thames, there would have been a different story to tell. As I approached Falmouth, I destroyed a 3,000-ton boat from Cork, laden with butter and cheese. It was my only success for 3 days. That night, Friday, April 16th, I called up Stephan, but received no reply. As I was within a few miles of our rendezvous, and as he would not be cruising after dark, I was puzzled to account for his silence. I could only imagine that his wireless was deranged, but alas! I was soon to find the true reason from a copy of the Western Morning News which I obtained from a Brixham trawler. The Capper, with her gallant commander and crew, were at the bottom of the English Channel. It appeared from this account that after I had parted from him he had met and sunk no fewer than 5 vessels. I gathered these to be his work, since all of them were by gunfire, and all were on the south coast of Dorset or Devon. How he met his fate was stated in a short telegram which was headed "Sinking of a hostile submarine." It was marked Falmouth, and ran thus: "The P&O mail steamer Macedonia came into this port last night with 5 shell holes between wind and water. She reports having been attacked by a hostile submarine 10 miles to the southeast of the Lizard. Instead of using her torpedoes, the submarine for some reason approached from the surface and fired 5 shots from a semi-automatic 12-pounder gun. She was evidently under the impression that the Macedonia was unarmed. As a matter of fact, being warned of the presence of submarines in the channel, the Macedonia had mounted her armament as an auxiliary cruiser. She opened fire with 2 quick firers and blew away the conning tower of the submarine. It is probable that the shells went right through her, as she sank at once with her hatches open. The Macedonia was only kept afloat by her pumps." Such was the end of the Kappa and my gallant friend, Commander Stephan. His best epitaph was in a corner of the same paper, and was headed "Mark Lane." It ran: "Wheat average 66, maize 48, barley 50." Well, if Stephan was gone, there was the more need for me to show energy. My plans were quickly taken, but they were comprehensive. All that day, Saturday, I passed down the Cornish coast and round Land's End, getting 2 steamers on the way. I had learned from Stephan's fate that it was better to torpedo the large craft, but I was aware that the auxiliary cruisers of the British government were all over 10,000 tons, so that for all ships under that size it was safe to use my gun. Both these craft, the Yelland and the Playboy, the latter an American ship, were perfectly harmless, so I came up within 100 yards of them and speedily sank them, after allowing their people to get into boats. Some other steamers lay farther out, but I was so eager to make my new arrangements that I did not go out of my course to molest them. Just before sunset, however, so magnificent a prey came within my radius of action that I could not possibly refuse her. No sailor could fail to recognize that glorious monarch of the sea, with her 4 cream funnels tipped with black, her huge black sides, her red bilges, and her high white top hamper, roaring up channel at 23 knots, and carrying her 45,000 tons as lightly as if she were a 5-ton motor boat. It was the queenly Olympic of the White Star, once the largest and still the comeliest of the liners. What a picture she made, with the blue Cornish sea creaming round her giant forefoot, and the pink western sky, with one evening star forming the background to her noble lines. She was about 5 miles off when we dived to cut her off. My calculation was exact. As we came abreast, we loosed our torpedo and struck her fair. We swirled round with the concussion of the water. I saw her in my periscope list over on her side, and I knew that she had her death blow. She settled down slowly, and there was plenty of time to save her people. The sea was dotted with her boats. When I got about 3 miles off, I rose to the surface, and the whole crew clustered up to see the wonderful sight. She dived, bows foremost, and there was a terrific explosion, which sent one of the funnels into the air. I suppose we should have cheered. Somehow none of us felt like cheering. We were all keen sailors, and it went to our hearts to see such a ship go down like a broken eggshell. I gave a gruff order, and all were at their posts again, while we headed northwest. Once round the Land's End, I called up my 2 consorts, and we met next day at Hartland Point, the south end of Bidford Bay. For the moment the channel was clear, but the English could not know it, and I reckoned that the loss of the Olympic would stop all ships for a day or 2 at least. Having assembled the Delta and Epsilon, one on each side of me, I received the report from Miriam and Var, the respective commanders. Each had expended 12 torpedoes, and between them they had sunk 22 steamers. 1 man had been killed by the machinery on board of the Delta, and 2 had been burned by the ignition of some oil on the Epsilon. I took these injured men on board, and I gave each of the boats one of my crew. I also divided my spare oil, my provisions, and my torpedoes among them, though we had the greatest possible difficulty in those crank vessels in transferring them from one to the other. However, by 10 o'clock it was done, and the 2 vessels were in condition to keep the sea for another 10 days. For my part, with only 2 torpedoes left, I headed north up the Irish Sea. One of my torpedoes I expended that evening upon a cattle ship making for Milford Haven. Late at night, being abreast of Holyhead, I called upon my 4 northern boats, but without reply. Their Marconi range is very limited. About 3 in the afternoon of the next day I had a feeble answer. It was a great relief to me to find that my telegraphic instructions had reached them, and that they were on their station. Before evening we all assembled in the lee of Sanda Island, in the Mull of Kintyre. I felt an admiral indeed when I saw my 5 whalebacks all in a row. Panza's report was excellent. They had come round by the Pentland Firth and reached their cruising ground on the 4th day. Already they had destroyed 20 vessels without any mishap. I ordered the Beta to divide her oil and torpedoes among the other 3, so that they were in good condition to continue their cruise. Then the Beta and I headed for home, reaching our base upon Sunday, April 25th. Off Cape Wrath I picked up a paper from a small schooner. Wheat 84, maize 60, barley 62. What were battles and bombardments compared to that? The whole coast of Norland was closely blockaded by cordon within cordon, and every port, even the smallest, held by the British. But why should they suspect my modest confectioner's villa more than any other of the 10,000 houses that faced the sea? I was glad when I picked up its homely white front in my periscope. That night I landed and found my stores intact. Before morning the Beta reported itself, and we had the windows lit as a guide. It is not for me to recount the messages which I found waiting for me at my humble headquarters. They shall ever remain as the patents of nobility of my family. Among others was that never to be forgotten salutation from my king. He desired me to present myself at Hopeville, but for once I took it upon myself to disobey his commands. It took me 2 days, or rather 2 nights, for we sank ourselves during the daylight hours, to get all our stores on board, but my presence was needful every minute of the time. On the third morning at 4 o'clock, the Beta and my own little flagship were at sea once more, bound for our original station off the mouth of the Thames. I had no time to read our papers while I was refitting, but I gathered the news after we got under way. The British occupied all our ports, but otherwise we had not suffered at all, since we have excellent railway communications with Europe. Prices had altered little, and our industries continued as before. There was talk of a British invasion, but this I knew to be absolute nonsense, for the British must have learned by this time that it would be sheer murder to send transports full of soldiers to sea in the face of submarines. When they have a tunnel they can use their fine expeditionary force upon the continent, but until then it might just as well not exist so far as Europe is concerned. My own country, therefore, was in good case and had nothing to fear. Great Britain, however, was already feeling my grip upon her throat. As in normal times, 4/5 of her food is imported. Prices were rising by leaps and bounds. The supplies in the country were beginning to show signs of depletion, while little was coming in to replace it. The insurances at Lloyd's had risen to a figure which made the price of food prohibitive to the mass of the people by the time it had reached the market. The loaf, which under ordinary circumstances stood at 5 pence, was already at 1 and 2 pence. Beef was 3 shillings and 4 pence a pound, and mutton 2 shillings and 9 pence. Everything else was in proportion. The government had acted with energy and offered a big bounty for corn to be planted at once. It could only be reaped 5 months hence, however, and long before then, as the papers pointed out, half the island would be dead from starvation. Strong appeals had been made to the patriotism of the people, and they were assured that the interference with trade was temporary, and that with a little patience all would be well. But already there was a marked rise in the death rate, especially among children, who suffered from want of milk, the cattle being slaughtered for food. There was serious riotings in the Lanarkshire coalfields and in the Midlands, together with a socialistic upheaval in the east of London, which had assumed the proportions of a civil war. Already there were responsible papers which declared that England was in an impossible position, and that an immediate peace was necessary to prevent one of the greatest tragedies in history. It was my task now to prove to them that they were right. It was May 2nd when I found myself back at the Maplin Sands to the north of the estuary of the Thames. The Beta was sent on to the Solent to block it and take the place of the lamented Kappa. And now I was throttling Britain indeed. London, Southampton, the British Channel, Liverpool, the North Channel, the Glasgow approaches, each was guarded by my boats. Great liners were, as we learned afterwards, pouring their supplies into Galway and the west of Ireland, where provisions were cheaper than has ever been known. Tens of thousands were embarking from Britain for Ireland in order to save themselves from starvation. But you cannot transplant a whole dense population. The main body of the people by the middle of May were actually starving. At that date wheat was at 100, maize and barley at 80. Even the most obstinate had begun to see that the situation could not possibly continue. In the great towns starving crowds clamored for bread before the municipal offices, and public officials everywhere were attacked and often murdered by frantic mobs, composed largely of desperate women who had seen their infants perish before their eyes. In the country, roots, bark, and weeds of every sort were used as food. In London, the private mansions of ministers were guarded by strong pickets of soldiers, while a battalion of guards was camped permanently round the Houses of Parliament. The lives of the Prime Minister and of the Foreign Secretary were continually threatened and occasionally attempted, and yet the government had entered upon the war with the full assent of every party in the state. The true culprits were those, be they politicians or journalists, who had not the foresight to understand that unless Britain grew her own supplies, or unless, by means of a tunnel, she had some way of conveying them into the island, all her mighty expenditure upon her army and her fleet was a mere waste of money, so long as her antagonists had a few submarines and the men who could use them. England has often been stupid, but has got off scot-free. This time she was stupid and had to pay the price. You can't expect luck to be your savior always. It would be mere repetition of what I have already described if I were to recount all of our proceedings during the first 10 days after I resumed my station. During my absence the ships had taken heart and had begun to come up again. In the first day I got 4. After that I had to go farther afield, and again I picked up several in French waters. Once I had a narrow escape through one of my Kingston valves getting some grit into it and refusing to act when I was below the surface. Our margin of buoyancy just carried us through. By the end of that week the channel was clear again, and both Beta and my own boat were down west once more. There we had encouraging messages from our Bristol consort, who in turn had heard from Delta at Liverpool. Our task was completely done. We could not prevent all food from passing into the British Islands, but at least we had raised what did get in to a price which put it far beyond the means of the penniless, workless multitudes. In vain government commandeered it all and doled it out as a general feeds the garrison of a fortress. The task was too great, the responsibility too horrible. Even the proud and stubborn English could not face it any longer. I remember well how the news came to me. I was lying at the time off Selsey Bill when I saw a small war vessel coming down channel. It had never been my policy to attack any vessel coming down. My torpedoes and even my shells were too precious for that. I could not help being attracted, however, by the movements of this ship, which came slowly, zigzagging in my direction. Looking for me, thought I. What on earth does the foolish thing hope to do if she could find me? I was lying awash at the time and got ready to go below in case she should come for me. But at that moment, she was about half a mile away, she turned her quarter, and there, to my amazement, was the red flag with the blue circle, our own beloved flag, flying from her peak. For a moment I thought this was some clever dodge of the enemy to tempt me within range. I snatched up my glasses and called on Vornal, and then we both recognized the vessel. It was the Juno, the only one left intact of our own cruisers. What could she be doing flying the flag in the enemy's waters? Then I understood it, and turning to Vornal, we threw ourselves into each other's arms. It could only mean an armistice or peace. And it was peace. We learned the glad news when we had risen alongside the Juno, and the ringing cheers which greeted us had at last died away. Our orders were to report ourselves at once at Blankenberg, and then she passed on down channel to collect the others. We returned to port upon the surface, steaming through the whole British fleet as we passed up the North Sea. The crews clustered thick along the sides of the vessels to watch us. I can see now their sullen, angry faces. Many shook their fists and cursed us as we went by. It was not that we had damaged them. I will do them the justice to say that the English, as the old Boer War has proved, bear no resentment against a brave enemy, but that they thought us cowardly to attack merchant ships and avoid the warships. It is like the Arabs who think that a flank attack is a mean, unmanly device. War is not a big game, my English friends. It is a desperate business to gain the upper hand, and one must use one's brain in order to find the weak spot of one's enemy. It is not fair to blame me if I have found yours. It was my duty. Perhaps those officers and sailors who scowled at the little Iota that May morning have by this time done me justice, when the first bitterness of undeserved defeat was past. Let others describe my entrance into Blankenberg. The mad enthusiasm of the crowds and the magnificent public reception of each successive boat as it arrived. Surely the men deserved the grant made them by the state. which has enabled each of them to be independent for life. As a feat of endurance, that long residence in such a state of mental tension, in cramped quarters, breathing an unnatural atmosphere, will long remain as a record. The country may well be proud of such sailors. The terms of peace were not made onerous, for we were in no condition to make Great Britain our permanent enemy. We knew well that we had won the war by circumstances which would never be allowed to occur again, and that in a few years the island power would be as strong as ever, stronger perhaps for the lesson that she had learned. It would be madness to provoke such an antagonist. A mutual salute of flags was arranged, the colonial boundary was adjusted by arbitration, and we claimed no indemnity beyond an undertaking on the part of Britain that she would pay any damages which an international court might award to France or to the United States for injury received through the operations of our submarines. And so ended the war. Of course, England will not be caught napping in such a fashion again. Her foolish blindness is partly explained by her delusion that her enemy would not torpedo merchant vessels. Common sense should have told her that her enemy will play the game that suits them best, that they will not inquire what they may do, but they will do it first and talk about it afterwards. The opinion of the whole world now is that if a blockade were proclaimed, one may do what one can with those who try to break it, and that it was as reasonable to prevent food from reaching England in wartime as it is for a besieger to prevent the victualling of a beleaguered fortress. I cannot end this account better than by quoting the first few paragraphs of a leader in the Times which appeared shortly after the declaration of peace. It may be taken to epitomize the saner public opinion of England upon the meaning and lessons of the episode. "In all this miserable business," said the writer, "which has cost us the loss of a considerable portion of our merchant fleet and more than 50,000 civilian lives, there is just one consolation to be found. It lies in the fact that our temporary conqueror is a power which is not strong enough to reap the fruits of her victory. Had we endured this humiliation at the hands of any of the first-class powers, it would certainly have entailed the loss of all our crown colonies and tropical possessions, besides the payment of a huge indemnity. We were absolutely at the feet of our conqueror, and had no possible alternative but to submit to her terms, however onerous. Norland has had the good sense to understand that she must not abuse her temporary advantage, and has been generous in her dealings. In the grip of any other power we should have ceased to exist as an empire. Even now we are not out of the wood. Some one may maliciously pick a quarrel with us before we get our house in order, and use the easy weapon which has been demonstrated. It is to meet such a contingency that the government has rushed enormous stores of food at the public expense into the country. In a very few months the new harvest will have appeared, and on the whole we can face the immediate future without undue depression, though there remain some causes for anxiety. These will no doubt be energetically handled by this new and efficient government, which has taken the place of those discredited politicians who led us into a war without having foreseen how helpless we were against an obvious form of attack. Already the lines of our reconstruction are evident. The first and most important is that our party men realize that there is something more vital than their academic disputes about free trade or protection, and that all theory must give way to the fact that a country is in an artificial and dangerous condition if she does not produce within her own borders sufficient food to at least keep life in her population. Whether this should be brought about by a tax upon foreign foodstuffs, or by a bounty upon home products, or by a combination of the two, is now under discussion. But all parties are combined upon the principle, and though it will undoubtedly entail either a rise in prices or a deterioration in quality in the food of the working classes, they will at least be insured against so terrible a visitation as that which is fresh in our memories. At any rate, we have got past the stage of argument. It must be so. The increased prosperity of the farming interest, and, as we will hope, the cessation of agricultural emigration will be benefits to be counted against the obvious disadvantages. The second lesson is the immediate construction of not one but two double line railways under the Channel. We stand in a white sheet over the matter, since the project has always been discouraged in these columns, but we are prepared to admit that had such a railway communication been combined with adequate arrangements for forwarding supplies from Marseilles, we should have avoided our recent surrender. We still insist that we cannot trust entirely to a tunnel, since our enemy might have allies in the Mediterranean. But in a single contest with any power of the north of Europe, it would certainly be of inestimable benefit. There may be dangers attendant upon the existence of a tunnel, but it must now be admitted that they are trivial compared to those which come from its absence. As to the building of large fleets of merchant submarines for the carriage of food, that is a new departure which will be an additional insurance against the danger which has left so dark a page in the history of our country. End of Danger.